In the opening scene of Learning to Love Again, we see Jane hiding in a blanket fort as she talks on the phone with her best friend, Daria. Jane dreads going home to see her family, who torture her for being single, and believes it'll be worse since her brother is getting married. Daria shows up at her house and joins Jane in the blanket fort. Jane opens up to her about how she feels like she's falling backward, while the people she knows are making huge steps forward. She used to focus on her job to distract herself from her thoughts, but she got laid off. Daria thinks being around her family would cheer her up, but Jane is scared, since she hasn't told her family that she lost her job. Daria thinks that she can tell them, since it's Thanksgiving. Jane is still hesitant, and mentions the fact that her brother has been mean to her, and Daria tries to make her feel better by saying that she got to move to the city, while he's still staying in the block they grew up in. She also assures Jane that she's a phone call away if she feels lost, and also teases her for using a landline. Jane says that she feels comforted by old things, and agrees to go home. In the next scene, Jane is driving to her hometown, and it's now late in the evening. She drives past a man who waves her down for help, suspecting that he's a murderer, but decides to turn back and ask if he needs something. The man thanks her for coming back, and she warns him to not try anything funny before getting out. He introduces himself as Chris and tells her what happened with his car. His phone is flat, so he hasn't been able to make calls. Jane tells him that he can charge it in his car, but finds out that it's an old car from his father. Chris confesses that he loves old things, and she admits that she likes them too. She gives him her phone to call a tow truck, and tells them that the car is on the way to Hope Junction. He returns her phone after the call, and appreciates her for helping him. Jane asks if he's headed to Hope Junction, and he confirms that he is going there for a meeting. She offers him a ride. On their ride to Hope Junction, Chris thanks Jane once again for helping him, and she finds out that they're staying in the same hotel, Bumblebee Inn. Chris wonders why she's staying at a hotel when her family is from the area, and she gives him a vague explanation of things with her family, and how it'll be more comfortable for her to stay at a hotel. He offers to listen if she wants to talk about it, revealing that he's an English teacher making his way across the country, but Jane rejects his offer. She finds out that he also grew up in Hope Junction, and Chris tells her that his fondest memories are from living there. They must have had different experiences, because Jane moved away as soon as she could. Chris doesn't think so, since she is back in the town, but she clarifies that she's back for just Thanksgiving. They arrive at the Bumblebee Inn and the receptionist, Alois, mistakes them for a couple when asking for their reservation, but Jane quickly corrects her. They confirm that they have separate reservations, and Jane finds it necessary to emphasize the fact that they're not a couple by comparing them to nuts. Alois stares at them in confusion as they start talking about nuts. She's allergic to nuts. She assigns them to their rooms, which are close to each other. In her room, Jane gets cleaned up and goes to bed. The next day, Jane's parents, Joe and Mary, prepare to welcome their children. Jane is the first to get there, and is excitedly welcomed by her mom, who's asking to hear everything that's up with her. Jane feels pressured, and lies that everything is great. Her father also welcomes her with a hug and asks if she got his gift, a real ham radio. She confirms that she got it, and he tells her to radio directly whenever she has news, like a big promotion. Jane changes the topic and turns to the food set up on the table. She tries a scone and compliments her mom's baking. Mary comes up with the idea that Jane should participate in the yearly bake-off, since she won't be competing. She then asks if Jane has a partner, and tries to reassure her that she doesn't need a romantic partner, even though all the participants are couples. Jane gets overwhelmed as her mother decides to call her friend Mrs. Yarrow, who seems to know a lot of young men. Just then, Jane's brother Greg shows up, and immediately gets on her nerves. Jane is provoked by her brother, and decides to join the bake-off, but tells her mother that she has a partner already. She leaves for the restroom and scolds herself for lying about having someone. Mary is worried when she hears muffled sounds from the bathroom, but Jane assures her that she is okay. She composes herself before coming out to join her brother at the table. Mary gives Jane a list, and asks the two of them to go grocery shopping for her. In the next scene, Greg can't stop talking about how his wedding plans are going, and how he got a big promotion. Jane thinks he's being smug, and he calls her a bigger spinster, which pisses her off. She tells him to stay outside while she gets the groceries. Outside, Greg is approached by his old friend, who turns out to be Chris. Greg is happy to see him, and tells Chris that his sister is also in town. Chris remembers Jane as the girl who conjured the Bloody Mary to put a hex on him. Greg invites Chris to have dinner with his family, and Chris jokes that he should ask his sister first, but later agrees. As soon as Chris leaves, Jane comes out of the store with the groceries. In the next scene, Mary informs Jane that Greg's old friend Chris will be joining them for dinner. Jane gets angry that they invited a traitor for dinner, who poured fruit punch all over her when he was supposed to be her partner for the science fair. The annoying thing is that he did it just for a laugh. Mary thinks it's a cute story, but Jane doesn't find it cute in any way. Her mom tells her that he's asking after her, so she should go out to greet him. Jane decides to do as she's told, but warns that she won't be gracious, and she won't be giving him any crab cake, She joins them and sees that he's the man she saved, a good deed she instantly regrets. She doesn't hide the fact that she still holds a grudge against him, and it gets worse when he calls her Pinky Lane, the name everyone called her in middle school after he doused her in fruit punch. Her family, as well as Angela, Greg's fiancée, watch them in silence as they banter. She slaps his hand when he tries to reach for the crab cake, and shares it with everyone except him. After the dinner, Joe tells Jane that he and Mary are thinking of choosing Chris as her partner, in hopes that sparks fly between them. Jane is distraught upon hearing the news. At the hotel, Jane calls Daria to tell her that her parents are trying to set her up with Chris. Daria doesn't get why she changed her mind after saying he was cute, and Jane explains that he's Chris Lillehammer. This information shocks Daria, but she doesn't see it as something serious, and tells Jane to lighten up. Jane doesn't want to let go of the fact that he embarrassed her, but Daria thinks she should try letting it go. They hang up, and Jane goes downstairs to get something to snack on. She's a few minutes late, as the dining room is closed. Alois informs her that there's a vending machine with shrink-wrapped snacks and questionable best before dates down the hall, and gives her a quarter. Jane gets there and sees Chris shaking the machine. She mocks him for not being able to use the machine, and gives it a try. She fails at first, but soon fixes it, and is commended by Chris. Jane explains that she worked in a factory that made the machines, and looked at their programming code, and Chris compares her to Angelina Jolie in Hackers. He brings up the topic of her parents trying to set them up, and she apologizes to him, saying that she's not interested in dating, especially not him. She quickly takes back what she said, but he feels the same way. They know they can't escape their fate of being partners in the bake-off, and joke about making couple bracelets. Jane gets an insane idea to lie to her parents that they're already dating, so that they stop pressuring them. Chris agrees to do it because he thinks it's hilarious to lie to his parents, adding that his parents think he's a doctor, while his grandma thinks he's a priest. He leaves for his room while she stands there, shocked. The next day, Jane runs into Angela while shopping. She's self-engrossed and does all the talking, without letting Jane say anything. She tells Jane that she'll be co-hosting the brunch that Joe and Mary planned for the next day, and that she expects her to be there. Angela points out the fact that Jane is single by making comments about how it'll be weird to show up at her brother's wedding without a partner. Jane finally talks, and states that she's not worried, since the wedding is 6 months away, and that she's supposed to meet her partner at the shop. She spots Chris and calls him. He immediately understands and acts as the character. Angela is surprised, since they acted like they hated each other the day before, so they make up an excuse saying Jane was nervous. Angela pretends to be happy for Jane, and invites Chris for brunch before leaving. Chris and Jane head over to where Mrs. Yarrow is, and Jane introduces him to her. Mrs. Yarrow remembers him and asks after his parents, before inviting them to the Lane brunch the next day. Afterward, Chris helps Jane take the things she bought from the shop to her car. They commend each other for being convincing. It turns out that they did not plan to meet at the shop. He asks why she bought flour, and she informs him that she'll be participating in the bake-off, so she needs to practice. Jane offers him a ride, but he has other appointments and decides to walk. Later, Jane gets a call from Daria asking how her long con is going, and Jane tells her that it's growing longer. Daria is worried that Jane is falling for Chris, but Jane assures her that she panicked for a moment, but cannot take him as a serious romantic option. She just doesn't want to be known as a spinster during the holidays. After that, she'll break up with him through social media. In the next scene, Jane invites Chris to bake a pie with her. She guides him patiently through the steps, and it goes well. Afterward, she tells him that Daria thinks their plan is ridiculous, but Chris thinks it'll only be ridiculous if Jane falls for him. And they both don't see that happening, especially Jane, who's still finding it hard to forget about the fruit punch incident. Chris thinks it's time for her to forget about something that happened 20 years ago, and apologizes for calling her Pinky Lane. He promises not to put her in that kind of situation again, but she doesn't trust him. Chris tells her to fake trust him, because he'd feel fake bad if she got hurt again, and Jane confesses that she wanted to fake date him so that she wouldn't really date him. Their faces get close and they both lean in for a kiss, but are interrupted by the oven alarm. They check out their pie, and are proud of the outcome. Just then, Greg walks in on them and is shocked that they are together. He exclaims, gaining their attention. Angela also told him about Chris and Jane being in a relationship, but he didn't think it would be true. Jane takes Greg outside to talk privately. Greg isn't happy that she is dating his friend, who's supposed to be her nemesis, and suspects something fishy is going on. Jane tells him that they're crazy about each other, and he'll see them at brunch. Chris joins them to ask if everything's alright, and Greg pretends like everything is fine before walking out. As soon as he leaves, Jane tells Chris to bring his A-game to the brunch. In the next scene, Jane and Chris bring a pie to the brunch. Greg and Angela are having their moment, as he adores her and calls her cute. As soon as Jane and Chris walk in, Greg walks up to them. Jane and Chris are excitedly welcomed by Mary, who can't stop smiling at her daughter and Chris. Greg joins them and introduces Chris as Jane's new boyfriend. Before taking the pie they brought, Mary is happy for Jane and thinks her relationship with Chris is like a story. Chris goes after him, and Greg asks him what is going on, but Chris pretends not to know what he's talking about. Meanwhile, Mrs. Yarrow sees Chris and turns to look for Jane before leaving the buffet table. She asks when Jane realized that things are special between them, and Jane struggles to answer the question. Chris shows up and saves the day, telling the woman that he has liked Jane since kindergarten, but lost her, and is happy that they are together now. Mary and Mrs. Yarrow find his story romantic. Just then, Angela joins them and hugs Jane. Mrs. Yarrow commends Angela on her quiche and is looking forward to seeing her at the bake-off, which is taking place the next day, before leaving with Mary. Angela asks how Jane met Chris, and Jane lies that he was trapped in a cage at a zoo and she busted him out. Angela leaves, and Jane confesses that she made up the zoo incident because she panicked. Chris thinks he's the only one committed to the relationship, and Jane reminds him that the relationship is fake. Greg creeps up on them, but fortunately doesn't hear what they say. Greg tries to put Jane down by calling her a disaster, but Chris defends her, and Greg leaves, defeated. Jane walks Chris out, and he tells her that her family seems to love her, but Jane doesn't think Greg feels that way about her. She helps him with his coat and scarf, and he comments that she's the best fake girlfriend, flattering her. They bid each other goodbye, and Jane smiles as he leaves. In the next scene, Jane arrives at the inn and Alois runs up to her. She takes Jane to the kitchen and leaves. Jane sees Chris there, with a plate of food, and candles lighting up the room. Chris tells her to take a seat, and she commends him for the effort. She whips out her phone to take pictures for social media, which she thinks will make them look more authentic. She remains oblivious to the fact that Chris is looking at her with love-filled eyes. Jane thinks he's good at acting, and compliments him for making the story he told Mrs. Yarrow and Mary romantic, but he claims that it's a true story. He confesses that he likes her, and thought she felt the same way, but it seems like she doesn't. Jane admits that she didn't expect it. He points out that she built a wall around herself, which is a lot of work, but it's worth it if she considers going out with him for real. Jane then asks him to go to the bake-off with her as her partner, a real partner. Chris is so happy that he starts making jokes about how they're going to win the bake-off. The next day, Jane goes to Chris's room to get him, but he isn't there. She goes downstairs and sees Mrs. Yarrow, who tells her that Alois is replacing her as a judge in the bake-off, since her tummy is acting funny due to the quiche she ate the day before. Jane asks if she's seen Chris, but Mrs. Yarrow hasn't seen him. Jane suspects that he's at the competition hall and starts leaving. She tells Mrs. Yarrow, who's rushing to the toilet, to tell Chris that she's at the hall if she sees him. In the next scene, Alois states the rules of the competition before it begins. Jane arrives at the hall and searches for Chris, to no avail. She joins her family, and it turns out that she isn't the only partnerless one, as Angela came down with food poisoning too, due to the quiche she made. Joe asks where Chris is, and Jane thinks he's running late, but Greg doesn't think he'll come. Mary suggests that they partner up for the competition, but the siblings refuse the idea and start quarreling. Alois walks up to them and Jane tells her that she'll be performing alone, but Alois lets them know that single participants are not allowed to participate in the event. Mary convinces them, and Greg agrees, but in the end Jane is left with no choice than to partner up with her brother. She goes back to the table and agrees to be partners with Greg. Alois gives them their team numbers, and gives Jane some words of encouragement. Joe and Mary leave them to start baking, and Greg warns her to not make him lose. Jane reminds him snidely that her cooking didn't cause food poisoning. They start arguing about the division of labor and then about the recipe. They start insulting each other, Greg mostly using the fact that she was a long-time spinster, and how she must have seemed desperate to Chris, adding that no one wants to come home to a loser like her. He says the last part loud enough for everyone to hear. Jane is shocked and starts tearing up. She runs away, and Greg shouts after her as Joe looks at him, disappointed. Jane hides behind a rack of clothes, and Joe joins her. He tells her that being a jerk is how Greg shows his love for her, but Jane doesn't think he loves her in any way. It's even more annoying because he's always right. Joe asks if it's about Chris, and Jane decides to confess that Chris isn't her boyfriend. She tells him why she did it, and how she ended up looking like an idiot. Joe comforts her, advising her not to look down on herself, and he's always been proud of her for focusing on her career. Jane cuts him off to let him know that she was laid off 3 weeks ago, and Joe hugs her and comforts her. He tells her that they will try to find a job for her, and she can stay at home for some time. Jane agrees to think about it, and Joe takes her back to the competition. Greg welcomes her back, being a jerk as always. She confesses that Chris is not her boyfriend, and he rubs it in her face. She calls him out for always being a jerk to her, and he says that she's jealous of him, and is always tearing down his success. Jane has had enough, and drops the team number on the table before leaving. In the next scene, Mrs. Yarrow welcomes Jane when she returns. Jane is looking tired and depressed. She jumps on her bed and calls Daria, complaining that Chris blew her off, but her friend isn't surprised, since he's always sucked. Jane tries to defend him, saying he has changed, but Daria believes that people don't change easily. Jane also tells her that her father told her to move back home. Daria doesn't want to be left alone in the city, but wants what is best for Jane, as long as she's happy. Jane admits that everyone has been saying the same thing to her, and Daria thinks it's because they love her. Jane hears a knock on her door and hangs up the call. Chris is the one at the door. He came with flowers to apologize and explain what happened, but she doesn't want to listen to him, and lets him know that he humiliated her in front of her family. She gives him a chance to explain, but gets annoyed midway and shuts the door in his face. She tells him to leave before the count of 5, or she'll make a complaint to the front desk. He sees that she's not willing to talk to him, and drops the flowers by her door before leaving. She goes outside to check if he's there, but he is gone. She jumps on her couch and starts sobbing. She gets a call and answers it, but immediately cuts the call when she hears his voice. She decides to go for a walk and calls her parents' house, but they don't answer the call, so she leaves a message saying that she has decided to come home for a while. She continues her walk and finds a shop that is still open. Jane is deep in thought at the table when Chris walks up to her. She asks how he found her, and he tells her that it's the only shop open during the holidays. He asks if he could explain himself, and this time she hears him out. Chris explains that he's in town for a job interview, not a conference, and that he was let go 6 months ago, so when he got the call that morning, he had to go. He didn't expect the interview to take that much time, but he thinks it went well, since he was shown his classroom. He confesses that he didn't tell her because he didn't think she would be interested in someone that is unemployed, and Jane reveals that she's also unemployed. Chris asks her to forgive him, and she questions their relationship, because he repeated what he did to her in the past. Chris claims that he can be the person she desires, but she thinks he's all talk and no action. Just then, Jane receives a call from her mother telling her that Greg was in an accident. He was raking leaves off the roof and fell. She immediately forgets that she is sad. Mary confirms that he's okay, but asks her to come home. Jane calls a cab, but it won't get there for 2 hours, since it's Thanksgiving. Chris pulls up in his car, asking if she needs a ride. Jane decides to go with him, since she doesn't have another option. On their way to her parents' house, Jane confronts Chris for stalking her, and he doesn't deny it. Jane is still annoyed at him, and he tells her that he wouldn't have left if it was up to him, but she still doesn't trust him. Chris is aware of that, and states that there are worse things to distrust than someone who's been in love with her since kindergarten. In the next scene, Jane's parents welcome her as she hurriedly asks questions about her brother's condition. She's worried, since their last interaction was a fight. Chris comes in after her, and Jane explains that he was her ride. She leaves to see Greg, while Mary promises to keep Chris company. As soon as Jane sees Greg lying down on the couch with a neck brace and bandages on his wrist, she starts asking questions, clearly worried, but Greg jokes about it. Jane exclaims that he could have lost his life, and her last words to him would have been calling him a jerk. Greg apologizes for being hard on her, and they agree to be friends, on the condition that she's the first to sign his cast. She leaves to get food for him, and sees her mother laughing at the joke Chris told her. Mary asks Chris to call Joe, who had gone to get food, and as soon as he leaves, she tells Jane that she likes Chris. She wonders if he's the reason Jane decided to come home, and Jane admits that he's part of the reason. Chris returns to tell them that Joe is close by, and Jane makes it obvious that they were talking about him. In the next scene, Chris and Jane arrive at Joe and Mary's house, and are welcomed, especially by Greg. Mary walks in with drinks for everyone. Jane receives a call from Daria. Jane mentions that her voice sounds weird over the phone, and suddenly Daria comes out from a room. Jane hugs her in excitement, and Daria spots Chris, commenting that he glowed up. Daria gives Jane a bus ticket as a gift, to let her know that she's only a bus ride away. Jane is touched by the love from her best friend. They all gather to clink their glasses. In the last scene, Chris asks what Jane is thankful for, and she replies that she's thankful for her hair and wit. She asks him the same question, and he states that he's thankful that his car broke down and brought her to him. She's also thankful for him being there for her, and helping her get through the day. He wants her to let him into her heart, and she promises to consider it, if he's serious about sticking around. He reveals that he's serious, and kisses her for a short moment. She believes him and rests on his shoulder.